Okay, everybody, thank you and welcome to this week's seminar for the Centre for Educational Neuroscience. We're delighted you're here. It's my very great pleasure to introduce this week's speaker, who is Elisabeth Knight. I know her as Liz, so I will probably call her Liz sometimes. I first saw Liz's research at a conference a few years ago, and I thought it was just perfect for the CEN, so I invited her to come along, and I was very, very pleased when she agreed. So Liz is a PhD researcher in psychology at the University of Sheffield, where she's also a graduate teaching assistant in psychology and education. She was a primary school teacher for 14 years before completing an MSc in developmental psychology and beginning her doctoral studies. Her research focuses on how sensory motor modalities such as gesture interact with working memory and how contextual and individual differences impact learning outcomes over development. Generally, she's very keen to enhance links between cognitive research and educational practice. Today, she is going to be talking to us about the involvement of working memory, meta working memory, and iconic gestures when learning new words and concepts. So I am now going to hand over to Liz, who will share her screen. We are recording this, as you know. You can pop any questions you have in the chat, and then we'll go through those when Liz has finished her talk in about 40 to 50 minutes. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Rebecca, and thank you for inviting me today. It's really nice to be here. So I'm going to talk to you today about learning new words and concepts, and that's something that we do throughout our lives, and it's particularly particular sort of focus time for that is when we're in formal education. And I'm going to be talking about the involvement of working memory, meta working memory, and iconic gestures. And these are all, I think, really interesting topics and interrelated topics. And having a good understanding of these, I think, can help inform teaching practice and help us understand better about how children learn and how we can support those children who perhaps find it a bit more difficult to remember new words and concepts. So just to talk a little bit about some, well, I'll give an overview first of all. So an overview of the talk. So we're going to talk about some constructs first, so working memory and working memory capacity. And then I'm going to go into my the first research study that I conducted during my PhD, where we looked at whether working memory acted as a bottleneck to long-term memory. And in this, I'll talk a little bit about meta working memory and how that relates to working memory. I'll then sort of pivot a little bit and talk about my second study that I did during my PhD, which was relating to gesture and word learning and working memory. And I'll talk a little bit about different types and functions of co-speech gesture, and then how gesture relates to working memory and learning. And then talk about what we did in our second research study, where we looked at when gestures, when and if gestures can help young children learn. And within this as well, I'll be talking about measuring young children's metacognition. So metacognition is a kind of linking kind of topic here, really. And then there'll be some take-home messages at the end. So just to define working memory as a construct. So we can describe working memory as our ability to keep a small amount of information readily available in our current thinking, and this helps us support decisions and guide actions, and enables us to make statements, keep track of conversations. We use it to navigate and support creative thinking and problem solving. It helps us remember to do things in the current moment and to update our understanding of what's going on around us, our conception of what's going on around us at any given time. And it's a very small amount of information that we're able to keep in this very short-term memory that we have, working memory. And it's been found that a typical adult can hold about 4 chunks or 4 items in working memory. But this changes over development. So young children have a more limited capacity in their working memory, so they can hold fewer things there. And then as we get older, unfortunately, our working memory abilities and capacity also declines. So, and it also has been found that working memory capacity varies between individuals. And this is important when we think about teaching and learning, because working memory capacity is associated with educational outcomes, and it's been found to predict vocabulary acquisition and word learning in children. So in our first study, we wanted to look at whether working memory could be sort of defined, or whether working memory acts as a bottleneck to long-term memory. So if we overload our working memory, does that mean that we remember less in the long term? So to do this, my supervisor, Alicia Forsberg, designed a paradigm where she measured working memory and long-term memory in the same task, in the same experiment. So in the working, and she used pictures in this paradigm. So pictures were shown in different set sizes in working memory trials. So here you can see an example of a trial where there are 4 pictures shown. So participants would see these for a very brief period of time, then they'd see a blank screen, and then their working memory would be probed. So they'd be shown another picture, or a picture from the set, or a different picture, and they'd have to say if they thought they'd seen it, or if they didn't think they'd seen it. And then, so these set size was manipulated. So sometimes participants saw images in sets of 4, sometimes in sets of 2, sometimes in sets of 6. And it's important to note as well that the images were all unique. So they never saw, for example, the tennis racket more than once. And then after a short distraction task, there was a long-term memory task where the items from the working memory task were probed again. For example, this shows an example of an item that a law item that perhaps wasn't seen, and then this obviously was seen in this set, and then participants had to decide if they had seen those items in the working memory trials. So the findings from this were really interesting. So you can see here that Alicia and her colleagues did find that working memory was acting as a bottleneck to long-term memory. And we can see this because in working memory, participants were more likely to be able to remember items if they saw them in a smaller set size, if they saw them in a super capacity set size. For example, if they saw them in a set of 6, they were less likely to retain them in both in working memory and also in long-term memory. And here you can also see that developmental trajectory that I talked about earlier. So young adults perform better on the working memory trials and on the long-term memory trials than children did. But the set size effect was there for all of the different groups of participants. So in my first PhD study, we replicated this this paradigm, but we used verbal information instead of images. And we conducted 6 experiments with 6 different groups of participants. And in our first 2 experiments, we were looking at familiar words, so words that the participants would know. And in experiment 1A, we presented these in simultaneous sets, so very much like the images that I showed earlier. So this is a set of 2 familiar words shown simultaneously. And then again, there was a working memory probe. And then later on, there was a long-term, after all the working memory trials and the distraction task, there'd be a long-term memory task to probe the items from the working memory trials. And these would be either items they'd seen or the law items. And then experiment 1B was familiar words as well, but these were presented sequentially because we wanted to see if that bottleneck effect was also found with simultaneous presentation. In experiment 2A and 2B, we used the same paradigms, but we used novel words, so pseudo words, just to see if that what happened when we used words that were completely unfamiliar to participants, so novel verbal information. And then in our experiment 3A and 3B, we used auditory words. So we instead of having them visually presented, participants heard the words, and they heard auditory familiar words and auditory novel words. And obviously these were presented sequentially. So what did we find? So we found that known words, when they were presented in supracapacity contexts, were less likely to be retained. So just like with the images, if participants saw familiar words in a large set size of 6, they'd be less likely to retain it in working memory, and then also in long-term memory as well. And this was the same, this was found as well when words were presented sequentially. So this means that Alicia's finding with the images replicated. In experiment 2B, when we use novel words, 2A and 2B, when we use novel words, we found this as well. So again, and what's interesting to note here, I think, is that you can see this set size effect sort of even more clearly with this sort of unfamiliar information. So again, the finding replicated. But what has been really interesting when I've been looking at analysing the data and writing this paper up is that this finding we found, the finding we had with the auditory information, which was that when words were presented in an auditory modality, whether they were known or words or novel words, we found this set size effect in working memory, but we didn't find it in long-term memory. So this is a bit of a puzzle, and we're trying to work this out, why this might be. We think that possibly performance is really high in the auditory modality. It's higher than it was when the words were presented visually, and this is a kind of finding in the literature. There's an auditory advantage. Auditory information seems to be easier to retain in memory, to remember. And we think maybe the set size effect in working memory is due to when you hear 6 words in a sequence, you're less likely to remember the first 1 or 2. You've just got, because the time has passed. But then this finding that the set size effect doesn't transfer to long-term memory is a bit of a puzzle. We think in both with the familiar words and with the novel words, we think maybe some words are in this context, in this very sort of, it's long-term memory, but it's not after a very long time, it's after a short distraction task, and maybe just some words stick better than others, regardless of what set size they are presented in. So this is something that we're thinking a lot about at the moment. So if anybody has any ideas about that, then please do share them. So within this study as well, we also were thinking about metacognition, and we can define metacognition as our awareness of our current thinking and our ability to monitor, control, and reflect on our own thinking. And within this study, how we were looking at metacognition is we as well as measuring whether participants thought they'd heard or seen words, they had to rate their confidence. So confidence accuracy is a measure of your awareness of your own memory. So these are some really nice figures that my collaborator Nate Green has made to show how confidence and accuracy relate to each other in these 6 studies. And we can see that there's a positive confidence accuracy function. So this means that participants were aware of their strengths and weaknesses in working memory. For example, when they had high confidence, they were more accurate. And this was across all the set sizes in working memory, and also with the new items as well. So this just means when they were probed with they'd seen a set size of 2, and then they were probed with an item that they hadn't seen before. So a law, they were confident in saying that they hadn't seen it before. And we also found this in long-term memory as well. So again, participants were aware of their strengths and weaknesses in long-term memory. They were aware of what they remembered. I think there's more interesting things to delve into here, which I've not got time to talk about today, to do with the novel words compared with the familiar words, because we think there might be some they might be less confident and less accurate with the novel words than with the familiar words, and we're going to be looking into that a little bit more as well. So this finding, which is, it's not just this study that's found that people can be aware of their own memory and their own thinking, is really important. And the development of working memory, development of meta memory and meta working memory relates to learning, because if we're aware of our own strengths and weaknesses in our working memory, then perhaps this can help us overcome any working memory limitations we might have. For example, we might ask for repetition, or know that we need to restudy information, or develop some other strategies to support our working memory. So we know from this previous study I've just shown you, and lots of other research as well, that it's important not to overload our working memory. We know that instructional design can increase or decrease our working memory load. So I was really interested in my PhD to see what happened when new verbal information was communicated alongside gestural information. So words and gestures together. And does that, when we are teaching or when we're learning, does that increase our working memory load or decrease it? Can it help support our working memory? So this is where I'm pivoting a little bit to talk about gestures. So there are different types of post-speech gesture, and they've been sort of categorized in different ways. So deictic gestures are pointing, and that's a gesture that we learn to use very early on in development. Beat gestures are when I'm probably doing a lot of this at the moment, where we sort of move our hands or our bodies in kind of in time with what we're saying, or to emphasize things that we're saying. Pragmatic gestures can be defined as gestures that we use to facilitate communication. So, for example, if you're interacting with someone and you can see that they're wanting to say something, but you're still talking, you put your hand up and just, that indicates, wait, I'm still talking, or the floor is yours. And then emblem gestures are a little bit different. I guess they're kind of gestures that have a contextual and cultural meaning. For example, in UK culture, thumbs up often means that's good, or I understand, but it might mean something different in a different context or different culture. For example, if you're scuba diving, that means that you want to go up to the surface. But gestures I'm particularly interested in, which and these types of gestures do overlap as well. You could iconic representative gestures can be sort of performed alongside beat gestures. It's quite difficult to kind of pull apart these different types of gestures. However, gesture I'm particularly interested in are iconic or representative gestures, and these are gestures where we use our hands and our bodies to represent semantic information about the concept or the word that we're trying to communicate. So, for example, in this picture here, I'm talking about precipitation, and my hands are being the raindrops. And gestures it's thought that there are many different functions of gestures, and there are different theories about what these functions might be. So for a speaker, when a speaker's gesturing, it's thought that gestures might aid production of words via helping them conceptualize what they're thinking and put into words what they're thinking. It's thought they might help lexical retrieval, help to retrieve words. And some really interesting work has shown that gestures can relay implicit knowledge. For example, these two papers here are about children talking about their understanding of maths, and they found that children's gestures communicated, children's gestures showed that they actually understood more than perhaps would be thought if you just looked at or listened to what the child was saying. So the gesture, they might be saying one thing that's actually inaccurate, but their gesture seems to indicate that they do have a better understanding. For example, if I was to say, oh, this is an obtuse angle, and it was an acute angle, and I'm showing, yes, I know that it's that kind of angle, but I've got the word wrong, for example. So it can indicate that children are just on the verge of understanding a new concept, and I think that's really interesting. For an addressee who's seeing somebody else gesture, it's thought that gestures might aid comprehension through helping them predict what the next word's going to be. And it's also thought that gestures might help with processing new words for known concepts, for example, when we're learning a second language. And it also might assist with processing new words and new conceptual information. So when we're learning new words and concepts in our first language. So gestures are an important part of multimodal communication. They can indicate turn taking, they can indicate that we're listening, they can add semantic information about what we're saying. And so I'm really interested in how this interacts with working memory load. So the particular sort of function of gesture I'm interested in, and what I'll talk about in the next study, is how people observing gestures, how that seeing those gestures might help them to process new words for known concepts, or help them to process new words and new conceptual information. So some previous research has been done about teacher gesture, so children observing gestures and when they're learning new information. So in second language studies, there is some evidence that iconic gesture can support learning. However, there's also some contradictory and some mixed evidence relating to those findings, and then or to that finding. And then some studies have found that observing gestures supports learning for children who are learning English as an additional language, or and who have lower language abilities. And then in terms of learning our first language and novel conceptual information at the same time, it's been found that gestures enhance learning of mathematical concepts. And there's also an interesting finding that observing gestures, so learners observing teacher gestures supported learning, but when they were told to imitate those gestures, that hindered word learning for children who had lower language abilities. So that's an interesting finding that perhaps indicates that having children imitate gestures maybe overloads working memory. And then McGregor and colleagues did some interesting work looking at 2-year-olds learning the word and the concept of under, and they found that that observing somebody gesturing supported their deeper learning of this concept. So there is some research out there looking at these ideas, but there isn't a huge amount, and it's a bit mixed and contradictory. As a kind of theoretical background for this study, we also used the Ecolang corpus and project as a basis. And this is a corpus of semi-naturalistic paired interactions. And this project was conducted by Gabriella Vilioco and her colleagues at the UCL. So these are video recordings of adult pairs talking to each other and adults talking to children. And the pairs had to talk about, as part of the data set, they had to talk about unfamiliar animals and tools. For example, in the adult child corpus, they had to talk about a bison and a funnel. And some of the findings that have been that have come out from this project, where all the videos of these interactions have been coded and analysed, are that for children who had a lower receptive vocabulary, they seem to gain more benefit from when caregivers were using iconic gestures to talk about the objects. And that seemed to help them to recognise those objects later on when that was tested. Another interesting finding is that the timing of the gestures that people were using in these naturalistic interactions, when these represented words that were acquired later, then the gesture also came later in relation to the word than when the caregivers were gesturing to represent more familiar words. And that's a really interesting finding that indicates that these gestures might be serving a pedagogical function. And there's also an interesting finding in the adult corpus that for adults who had a lower working memory capacity, they seem to gain more benefit from speakers using iconic gestures. That seemed to help them in their recall of the information about the unfamiliar objects that they were talking about. They weren't talking about bison and funnels. They were talking about other sort of the slightly more obscure items. So in our research study, we wanted to look at when do gestures help young children learn. So using those findings from Ecolang, we used those to develop some hypotheses to test empirically. We recruited 51 children aged between 3 and 5 years in nurseries in and around Sheffield, and the testing happened in these nursery settings. So our hypotheses were that iconic gestures would support novel word recognition and conceptual understanding of novel words, especially when children had a lower receptive vocabulary. We also hypothesized that iconic gestures would support recognition and conceptual understanding, especially when children had a low working memory capacity. And also we pre-registered that we would do some exploratory work looking at the timing of these iconic gestures, representing, or how the timing of these iconic gestures, which represented novel words and concepts, affected the outcomes, and hypothesized that this might be important in some way as well. So the stimuli we used were based on the same stimuli, in fact, that they used in the Ecolang corpus. So I went down to UCL and I met Gabriella, and I took all her toys with me back on the train, which was fun. So the children were shown were given the stimuli. They were given a set of 3 stimuli in a nice bag, and they got to take them out and have a look at them. And that gave me an opportunity to assess whether they knew what the objects were, whether they knew the labels of them already. And then we hid them away in the bag again, and the children were shown 3 videos about the objects, and this was counted. So the videos were in 3 different conditions. So we had a no gesture condition, a before gesture condition, which I'll show you in a minute, and a demonstration gesture condition. So the children watched these 3 videos, and it was counterbalanced, so that some participants saw the iguana video in the no gesture condition, some in the before gesture, some in the demonstration gesture, and so on. I shall show you the videos.
This is an iguana. Iguanas look a bit like tiny dragons, and they have scaly skin and long tails. They live in forests where they like to climb trees. Iguanas eat leaves and fruits, and they can swim. Do you like the iguana?
This is the before gesture. So this is where the gesture comes just slightly before the onset of the word, or at the same time as the onset of the word.
This is a monocle. A monocle is like a little circle that you hold up to your eye. It is made of glass, and you can see through it. They were used instead of glasses a long time ago. Monocles make small things look bigger. Do you like the monocle?
And this was the demonstration gesture. So this is where the gesture of relating to the target word comes after the word.
This is an eel. Eels look a bit like snakes, but they are long, wiggly fish. They live under the sea and they hide in rocks and sand. Eels are different colours and some can shine in the dark. Do you like the eel?
Okay, so that just gives you a little flavour. Oops, I need to click on, don't want to watch those again. So the children then looked at another set of 3 toys, and then they did a recognition task where we showed them photographs that were, so we had 2 different tasks. So we used one with photographs and one with black and white drawings, and it was a forced choice recognition task. So these were relating to items that they had seen. So I asked the children, for example, can you show me the eel? Or can you show me the iguana? And the children would just point. Then we had 2 conceptual understanding tasks. The first one sort of tapped into their understanding of the locations of the animal or the tool, and that was information that was given in the videos. For example, I would say, where does the eel go? And then there was a second conceptual understanding task where we kind of tapped into their understanding of categories, so which category the items would go in. So I did a quick kind of explanation of this is a fork, this is a pair of scissors, this is a hammer, this is a cup, and this is a group of things. This is a cat, this is a duck, this is a turtle, this is an elephant. Then normally the kids would start saying, this is a turtle. This is a group of animals. And then I would say, so this is a group of things and this is a group of animals. Can you show me, where does the iguana go? And then we would repeat that with another block of 6 animals and tools. Okay, as well as doing the gesture and learning task, the children also did the working memory, the Wechsler preschool and primary scale of intelligence working memory task. So this is a picture memory task and a zoo locations task. So the first one taps into verbal working memory, although it's pictures, it's the children are thought to be remembering the associated words. So they're shown a picture really briefly, and then they're shown a set of pictures and they have to point to the picture they've just seen. And then it builds up. So you're identifying 2 and then 3 pictures. And then this taps into visuospatial learning. So you put the animals down and say the elephant and the tiger are playing here, and then you take them away and then you give them to the children and you say, can you show me, can you put them back where they were playing? And the children also participated in the receptive vocabulary test as well. So when I had conducted this with about 20 children, there's some sort of really interesting observations when children were doing this working memory task. And I started noticing that some children seemed really aware of their own working memory limitations, particularly in the picture memory task. I had one little girl who really stood out to me because she got quite far. She got on to remembering 3 pictures. So she was shown 3 pictures really quickly, and then she had to find them in a set of 6. She had to identify what she'd just seen, and she could do 2. She did 2 and then she just stopped, and I said, oh, there was one more, and it was almost as if she knew she could only remember 2. And I thought this was really interesting because she was only 3. And I mentioned this to my supervisor and she said, oh, why don't we include some kind of measure of metacognition? So remembering that metacognition is our awareness of our current thinking and our ability to monitor, control and reflect on our thinking, and it's associated with learning and educational outcomes. But there's more work needs to be done, shall we say, on looking at the developmental trajectory of metacognition and meta memory. We also thought it would be interesting to look at mind wandering, and this is another aspect of metacognition. So mind wandering means when we're thinking about that, it's in task unrelated thoughts, so it's internal thoughts rather than external distractions. So if, for example, if I'm talking and you start thinking about what you're going to have for tea instead of listening to me. And mind wandering is associated with poorer cognitive performance in children. And awareness of mind wandering can be defined as metacognitive knowledge. Regulation of mind wandering is metacognitive control. So as an exploratory couple of measures in the last sort of half of our data collection, we also brought in a meta memory task. So this I used after the end of the task. In fact, after the 2 working memory tasks, I would ask the children if they how much they thought they knew. So if they thought they knew where all the animals were, or they knew some and they guessed them, or they were just guessing. And then we also brought in this mind wandering task, which is it's kind of a measure of trait mind wandering, because we did it right at the end of all the tasks. And I asked the children, I showed them the children these monkeys one at a time. And I said, so when you're listening to your teacher telling a story, sometimes you might be able to listen really well and no other thoughts or ideas pop into your head. But sometimes you might start thinking about something else. Sometimes you might have more than one idea pop into your head, and so on. And I showed them these monkeys, and after a bit more explanation than that, the children identified which monkey they thought was most like themselves. So some preliminary results. So what was really good is that we only had to exclude one child for correctly. So these were our pre-registered exclusion criteria. We excluded one child because he correctly labelled 4 of the items. He knew loads about animals. So everybody else, the words seemed to be, the objects seemed to represent really sort of new words for them. And we excluded one participant because their performance was below chance on both recognition and conceptual understanding tasks. So it does seem that this was a suitable task to use for this age group, which was important. So what did we find? So vocabulary knowledge and iconic gestures, and the sort of effects of these on word recognition. We found evidence for a main effect of vocabulary on the recognition trials, and also on the conceptual understanding trials. So children who had a better vocabulary were also good at learning more new words. We did not find a main effect of gesture or interaction on either recognition or conceptual understanding. However, this is some preliminary figures. These are some preliminary figures. This is not the full data set. This is about half of the data set, but you can see there is a sort of wide range of responses, and there's a lot of individual differences. So the red, so each line here is a single participant, and the red ones are the children with the lower vocabulary scores on the BPVS. And so you can see that for some children, gestures seem to really help them. For other children, gestures didn't help them at all. And also we've got this, you can see this effect of vocabulary. So the children who had a better vocabulary performed better on the recognition task. And this is similar in the conceptual understanding task as well. So we wanted to check the correlation between the 2 working memory tasks, and it was reassuring to find that this was similar to other findings in the literature. So they do seem to be measuring the same thing. So we used the working memory index as described in the WIPSI suite of measures in that test to calculate the children's working memory index. And so what were our findings to do with working memory and iconic gestures on word recognition? So we found inconclusive evidence against a main effective gesture or working memory index on word recognition or conceptual understanding, and inconclusive evidence against an interaction. But again, there are a lot of individual differences here as well. So there is further analysis to do on this data set. These are just some preliminary findings. We also, as I said, wanted to explore whether the timing of iconic gestures representing novel words and concepts was really important. And this was this has been really interesting to dive into as well. So just to remind you that the demonstration gesture is the gesture that comes after the word.
This is an eel.
Okay, so like that. So we found that when we looked at the interaction between vocabulary knowledge and demonstration gestures, versus no gestures on conceptual understanding, that we did find evidence for a gesture vocabulary interaction. This is really interesting. So it seems that so I'm going to explore this further. So it seems that for some, so perhaps for children with a higher vocabulary, the gesture doesn't help them, but with a lower, and in fact, it might hinder their learning, but for children with a lower vocabulary, the gesture that comes after that word might help them. But we need to explore that. But we need to explore this more. So the meta memory results were interesting as well. So I think I carried this out, like I said, with about half of the sample. I think language was a bit of a barrier in getting children to really kind of understand what I was trying to ask them. So the understanding between the difference between the understanding of the difference between the meaning of no and guess is, I think, something that 3-year-olds are not particularly clear on. So I think this kind of the design of this needs some work, but it was interesting to find that the kind of, they didn't all pick the same one here. I think there's further works needed on this measure though. And then the mind wandering measure was also interesting. It was really interesting to implement, because when I was talking to them and explaining it to the children, I'd say, so sometimes you might start a different thought or idea might pop into your head, or you might start thinking about something else. And I did have one little one go, "What are thoughts?" And I thought, oh, we could have, yes, there's lots we could look at here, lots of thinking we could do about what thoughts are. It was a really sort of deep philosophical question, I thought. But I think this is a kind of a good start, and I think it does show that there are perhaps ways we can maybe look at how children are thinking about their own thinking, and whether they're able to think about their own thinking and their own mind wandering. So there's lots of further work that needs to be done. I'm going to look more at this vocabulary and timing interaction, and also about associations. I'm going to look into associations between the meta-memory measure we used, and mind wandering, and how that relates to children's performance on the other tasks. We need to do some item level analysis. We need to look at the raw scores and control for age, because how we controlled for age in this initial analysis was by using the standardized scores as kind of used in the manuals, which is a bit of more kind of broad way of kind of controlling for age, that if we use the raw scores, that will give us slightly more granular results and enable to look at the performance of the younger children compared to the older children. So I think that would be really interesting too. And then in future projects, I'm really interested to kind of carry on exploring meta memory, and I'm developing a project at the moment to look at meta memory and maths learning with some collaborators, which is really exciting. I'm also interested to try and explore more how we can capture children's meta memory abilities and their kind of knowledge of their own mind wandering. I think that's something that could be really interesting and beneficial to look at the development of these metacognitive abilities. So I've got some take-home messages. So first of all, working memory and meta-working memory abilities can impact learning, and these vary between individuals and change over development. But I think we can help learners become more aware of their thinking in different contexts. I think it needs to be very context, it needs to be done within context. I don't think you can sort of teach metacognition as a discrete thing, or maybe you can, but then you also need to, you know, involve it in the different things you're doing and teaching in school. And also teachers and learners' gestures are important and interesting, and we're sort of considering, because we all embody our conceptual understanding and perhaps what's going on in our working memory when we communicate. So we're not just saying it what we think, we're also kind of showing what we think as well in our gestures. So these are a couple of articles which might be interesting for you. So this is a blog that I wrote on the Bold platform, which is a really interesting platform and got lots of information about educational research and practice. And I wrote that with Alicia. And then this is Amanda Waterman's document with some practical advice to schools about and teachers about working memory in the classroom. Okay, I think that's about it from me. So thank you to all the children who piloted and took part in our study. Oops, it's gone off. Let's get that back. And my funders, University of Sheffield and the Jacobs Foundation, and my supervisors and collaborators. And thank you to you for listening.
Thank you, Liz. That was very, very interesting. You already know that in your work. Has anybody got any questions? You can pop them in the chat, or you can just raise your hand and ask away. If nobody has, in the meantime, I will ask a question as, oh, did somebody just speak? No, I'll ask a question as chair. I was just thinking about I can't remember what it was called, but when you gesture after so you go, this is an eel, and then you do the eel thing. And that improved memory in children with a low vocabulary, yes? Is that?
Well, there was an interaction. We're not sure yet. We need to look at, there was an interaction with the vocabulary. Yeah.
Oh, so you're not sure
with their vocabulary, not quite sure what's driving it at the moment. It's just.
Yeah. I was just wondering whether, and I'm just guessing as you go through your talk, but whether it has anything to do with depth of processing if it's children with a lower vocabulary, because it's kind of like it forces the sequential nature of the presentation of the information, forces deeper processing. So, this is an eel. What's an eel? And then you
get that information.
Yeah, you maintain your concentration, whereas and I understand you don't know which way it goes yet, but children with a greater vocabulary are just like, yeah, already got that. Don't need to.
Yeah, it's interesting. Certainly in the ecolang, it seems that it's almost a sort of implicit thing that parents were doing with their children. If they kind of were aware that it was a less familiar word, the gesture did seem to come later, maybe to kind of help that processing. They were aware that they needed that. I don't know. It's interesting.
It's something you intuitively do, isn't it? You sort of funny.
Yes. If you were talking to somebody who perhaps first language wasn't English or something, and you might think, oh, how can I? And I guess my sort of, this all comes from what I used to do when I was teaching a lot, which was to try and use gestures to support learning, and it seemed to help with some children, and so I was just really interested to try and find out why.
Yeah, it is. It's very interesting. I'm just going to go to the chat now because there's a couple of questions. Question from Cheyenne, I think that's how you pronounce it, who says that for your gestures, were these agreed by the team, or did they stem from a British Sign Language Macaton? I don't know what that is.
So I didn't Macaton is like sign supported English, so it's used with children. So not specifically. I just tried to think of how, if I was actually teaching about iguanas, what gesture would I use? And then you might have noticed that there were other gestures in the videos as well that we included alongside the conceptual information. We controlled for how many gestures we had in each video, but we tried to make them naturalistic. So I tried to think, under the sea, that seems like a reasonable way to show under the sea, and that might be what I would do with children. So it wasn't, we didn't use BSL or Macaton particularly, although in my teaching, that's often what we did. If we knew we were teaching a new word to our EAL children, we would look at what the sign was and see if it was iconic and representative and might be able to help them. Because there's obviously overlap between iconic gestures and signs.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you. Another question from Michael Thomas, who's the director of the centre. So he said, if you take results at face value, do the results mean the working memory bottleneck to long-term memory is only for visual information?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that doesn't seem to sort of make theoretical sense, really. I think it's probably more to do with our actual paradigm. Like you wouldn't think that you could just tell someone a big, long verbal explanation and they'd be able to, that their working memory wouldn't be overloaded, and they would be able to remember more than if they, say, read it. That doesn't kind of make sense. But I think it's probably more to do with the paradigm and the kind of processing that was going on in working memory, with the auditory compared to what was happening with the visual words. So yeah, that's something that I'm writing about at the moment in the discussion section. So if you've got any thoughts, that would be great.
Send them Liz's way. Yeah, Chris Gerald has made a comment on that, actually, saying, though depending on the age of the children, you'd expect them to also verbally recode the images. So maybe this is better described as verbal plus visual information. It's a comment that you don't have to answer, but it's just.
Yeah. I wonder if that relates to the Weschler picture memory test, maybe.
In relation to Michael's comment, but not Chris can always jump on and say if he's still here. But
I am, sorry, let me just turn my camera on. Elizabeth, you don't need to reply to that particularly. Sorry, I'm having trouble turning my camera on. Anyway, there it is. Yeah,
hi.
That particularly, I was just thinking, so this is your experiments at the start, the working memory, long-term memory experiments.
Oh, right. So I should have explained those were with adults. But yeah, Alicia's, yeah, I see what you mean. I see what you're saying. Yes, with the children with the pictures, yes.
Yeah, and so, but those pictures like tennis racket, pizza, you could name them, right? If you were not be familiar with those pictures, probably they would. So maybe they're dual coded. I mean, we don't know. You might, your performance might depend on recognizing the visual image.
Yes, yeah, that's a really that sort of relates to the second study as well, because I did notice, and I noted when we were doing the picture memory test, that some children named that they're not, then I didn't encourage it, didn't tell them to name it, and they're not, I didn't say anything about it, but they named the pictures as they were doing it. And there's a fire hydrant, which a lot of them, they were like, what's that? And I was like, I'll tell you at the end. But I'm going to look at any differences in those kids that name and if they actually performed better. So I think that'd be interesting. Thank you.
We've got another question from Victoria. Oh, sorry, it disappeared. Did you know the general number of vocabulary words between the children who showed high and low levels of vocab at the various ages? So, but their vocab scores, did you?
So their vocab scores. So on the PVS, so I used the standardized scores, like the age standardized scores, and I think the range was from about 80 to about 124. So it's quite a spread. So yeah, so the mean was around 101, and I think so. Yeah, it was quite a representative sample, I think.
Okay. So a question from Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa. So it's a very interesting talk. As there appears to be a number of studies that confirm that gesture support vocab in young children, there's a link if you want to see it later.
Yeah. I'll click on that.
I find most interesting aspect of your talk the reference to mind wandering. Do you have any theories as to the quantity and quality of mind wandering? For example, more non-related, that it's versus no unrelated, versus no unrelated thought versus lots of related thought. So I'm sorry, it's a bit, so I think it's just the degree of unrelated.
I reread it and I thought, oh my gosh, we're talking language. That was such a muddled question. So I'm sorry. No, I'm fascinated by the concept of mind wandering. I loved your example of how the kid asked what a thought was. And I was just wondering, because of these multiple sensory input, because of the gesture, the visual, and also the speaking and trying to pair these things and which comes first, second, I wonder if young kids themselves would actually be confused what mind wandering really was. Like they might really be on task, like they might be going to another place because they're linking an idea and they're, this big semantic recall, they're trying to get their schema around that type of an animal or something like that. And that wouldn't really be mind wandering, would it? And so I suppose we won't know because we're just asking the children, but it would be very interesting to see maybe in future work if all of this is really mind wandering itself, or is it really the search in your mind for what you already know based on what you're connecting to what you're connecting with, which is totally related. And so anyways, I loved that part of that. It was very, very interesting because I also just finished doing research looking at 3 to 5-year-olds don't even know they have a brain, right? So it's hard to ask them questions because they can feel their heart and they can feel their lungs, but they don't know about that. And so I think the really little kids, it's a fascinating topic. So thank you very much and I'm sorry for the confusing question. I don't even know, it doesn't have an answer.
Yeah.
Would require some other kinds of experimentation, but it just thinking.
Yes, it is fascinating to try and capture children's thinking about their thinking. But I've been collaborating with Agnieszka Graham in Belfast, and she's an expert in mind wandering, and she has the measure I showed would be kind of measure of trait mind wandering, and then she also does she measures state mind wandering. So in the midst of a task, I mean, we didn't do this here because we'd already designed the task and pre-registered and everything, but you could that kind of interrupt the task and ask the children, are you thinking about the task or are you thinking about something else? And so she kind of probes for mind wandering in that way. But I take your point about the kind of connections we might be making while we're listening, and is that mind wandering or is that just like learning and trying to connect new things with prior knowledge? So yeah, it's really fascinating. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. It's a good one to end on, actually, and I'll sort of expand on it. So it's from Kerry asking, have you looked at or considered looking at whether gesture might make a difference to children with autism that typically may have greater problems with meta memory? And I suppose we could expand that to different types of SEND groups.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't looked at that within my sort of current work. I did have one participant whose sibling was autistic, and because of that, his parent was using BSL a lot at home. So that was interesting, and the parent reported that this seemed, because when I was giving the information, talking to parents about that, I was looking at gestures and so on. The parents seem to be suggesting that was helping with their language learning, and certainly I think there's a lot of kind of research into use of Makaton and helping with communication, but also I think probably looking at it in terms of like actually learning is really important as well. Learning new words, I think that could be really interesting. Thank you.
Well, great. That brings us to 5 o'clock on the dot, which is perfect timing. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. This has been recorded, so if anybody wants to go back over it or recommend it to anybody else, it will be on our YouTube channel. Somebody has put in the chat a recommended a citation that you might want to look at.
Oh, thank you.
Tracy has put it in the chat. Thank you, Tracy. But yes, thank you. You are free to go. You've done your work.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.